Hi everyone, and welcome to the Excel training course today on pivot tables. What I've noted at the beginning is that before you start this course, you really need to be confident in this list of items here, and this is everything that we've covered already in the previous two courses. So if you're not confident, then get a bit more practice in perhaps before you study this course in detail. Okay, so we're looking at pivot tables today, and pivot tables are one of the most useful things in Excel for an accountant. But before we get there, I want to recap on the tables that we've done in previous courses. We learned that the principles of a good data table are that there is a column with a different and unique name in each column. Whatever you say is in the column should be in that column. Keep the formatting of the cells consistent in each column, and don't merge any cells in a table. We also looked at how we can check the data for errors by using CTRL SHIFT arrows, and that helps us navigate around and identify any gaps. We can use freeze panes to look through the data in a more useful way, and we can apply filters to help us look down the columns to find errors in the data. So the purpose of pivot tables, they are a step above the tables that we've looked at already. They are a super fast way to summarize data. They let you arrange and rearrange. They help you analyze data and spot errors. They create lovely, neat summaries that you can paste into other documents like donor reports or proposals. And they're an easy way to drill down into data, which is something that I'll show you a little later. Pivot tables really are one of the most useful tools in Excel. However, they rely on good quality data in the first place. And that's why in the last course we focused on good data in good tables. So I want to help you understand the value of pivot tables and convince you that these are a really important thing to get good at and learn how to use. So let's start with this example. Here's an extract of data from Project CView, and you're asked to provide a summary of the category of expenditure and the expenditure for 2020 and 2019. So bring up this example here. So I could start looking at this data and I could say, okay, I need to sum it here. So I'll press sum and I'll create a little sum here. Then I know that if I do Control C, Control V, it's carried my formula across. So that's okay. And then I need to sum these ones up here, don't I, for travel and accommodation. I need to hit brackets. Yep, so I could continue like that. But now I need to get it into a table. So now I need to bring over here my activities and travel. And now here I need my 2020, whoops, I've typed that wrong, 2019. And then I can start putting my totals in here. But we can see immediately that that's just taking us way too long. So it's taking way too long, too slow. There's also a risk of manual error in that I might not capture the right rows in the sum. For this amount of data, it's manageable. But if I had 100, 1,000, 10,000 rows of data, there's no way I'm going to be employing this technique. And if the data wasn't in order, I wouldn't be able to do this technique, I'd have to sort it first. And finally, you've seen that to do the summary table, I've had to do extra work as well. So this is not the way to approach it. Pivot tables is our answer here. Let's look at how we create a pivot table. The first step is that we're going to highlight the table that we want to convert to a pivot table. So we're going to be using CTRL SHIFT arrows, just like we learnt in our previous course. We must include the headers, and by headers I just mean the titles of each column. So we highlight that data, and that's step 1. Step 2, because we want to insert a pivot table, we can find this on the Insert ribbon, and here we find the option for Pivot Table. Step 3, we're simply going to press OK, and I'll tell you why. So when we press to create a pivot table, this box automatically comes up, and it's asking us 2 things. So the first thing it's asking us is this the table or range of data that you want to be converted into a pivot table? So here it's saying that it's from A3 to D39. And yes, that's what we highlighted. So that is the data we want to convert. So we don't need to do anything because we've already highlighted it. The second question it asks us is, are we going to put this pivot table into a new worksheet, or we could select an existing worksheet? Now, I would absolutely recommend that you just pick new worksheet every time, because then if you're playing around or you make an error, it's in a new worksheet, none of your other work is compromised, and besides, once your pivot table is finished, you can start pasting it to other places in your document anyway. So pick new worksheet, and then you have to do nothing, just press OK. So when we press OK, this is the screen that we will see in Excel. So this is what I call our pivot table builder. And here you can see that our headings from our table data have now come up as our options there. And for pivot tables, the technique we need to get used to is dragging these items from here into these fields here, these 4 fields. And then our pivot table will automatically be created here. Okay, we'll do a practical example in just a moment, but we'll just work through the steps first. So now we can see that in this example, I've dragged category of expenditure into my rows and into my values. Remember, I wanted to see 2020 and 2019. So I've dragged both of them into my values field. And already I now have a beautiful little summary table capturing exactly what I wanted. I've just noted here that you'll see the values are being treated as sums, and that is exactly what we want. We wanted to sum the data in those columns. And then finally, step 6, name the worksheet with your pivot table in it. And the reason for that is that if you start creating lots of different sheets, lots of new pivot tables, you can easily lose the one that you really want. So make sure you name it. So I'll just run through that example here with you now in the steps. So let's delete all of this. We don't need this anymore because we have a much better way of summarizing our data. So we're going to go CTRL SHIFT ARROW, which means that we've done step 1, highlight our data. Step 2, we want to insert something. So I was already on the insert ribbon. Insert pivot table. Step 3, if you remember, This has automatically brought in the range of data that I want to convert. New worksheet is fine. So all I'm going to do is press OK. Now you can see it's brought up my pivot table builder. So I'm going to take my category of expenditure and I'm going to drag it into my rows. So it's created the rows with the category types. And now into my values, because I want to know the value of my 2020 expenses and the value of my 2019 expenses. And there we have it. Step 5, I've created my table, and step 6, I'm going to call this my summary office. Okay. So that might have seemed quick, but you can do it. Follow the steps. So let's go to the exercises and have a go at doing that very same spreadsheet, that very same pivot table for ourselves. Okay, so you've had a go. And if anybody was struggling or feeling intimidated, I just want to remind you that the secret to pivot tables is practice, practice, practice. Keep experimenting with any data that you have, dragging and dropping, and then you can see what results you get. But whilst we are learning about pivot tables at the beginning, I know that it can sometimes be a little hard to visualize how you want your pivot table to look. And so because of that, I'll let you in on a bit of a cheat, which is the recommended pivot tables button. So we talked in the past about how Excel is intelligent and it can predict what we're trying to do. And the same is true for pivot tables. So on the Insert tab, I'll go back to my data. Here. On the Insert tab next to my pivot tables is also this option here, Recommended Pivot Tables. So let's click on this one. And what it has done, it's predicted the kind of pivot tables we might be looking for. And you can see here it's done a decent job. This looks very similar to what we wanted. Let's select this one. Yep. The only difference is it didn't bring in the 2019 data, but because it's given us this framework now, when we're starting out, it's given us the structure and we can build from there. So now I'll build my 2019 and I have my table again. And I'm not going to keep this one, so I'm going to delete it. Now, very useful when we're starting out, but what I would say is that the more data you have, the more columns, the less useful it might be in predicting exactly what you want. So it's really important that whilst this is a good starting tool, you do become confident by yourself in moving all that data around and creating your own pivot tables. So I want to look at sum versus count. In the example we've just done, we were summing expenses. Remember, we were summing 2020 and we were summing 2019. And we know that we were summing them because if we look back to our pivot table here, you can see here in the values sum of 2020 and sum of 2019. But you can also see that they have a little drop down arrow by them. So if I select that drop down arrow, the most useful function here that I want to look at is value field settings. And if I select value field settings, you'll see here that I do have an option. If I wanted to instead, I could count the items. I could also have other options like average, max, min, product, and then there's some heavy statistical options. But as a professional accountant. Sum and count are really the ones that I use. I've rarely, if ever, used the others, okay? But I want to show you why count can be useful, particularly for summarising M&E data. So let's just return to our notes. So in the first course, we looked at the difference between sum and count. Remember, we did this quick sum that comes up in the bottom right-hand corner of your Excel screen. And it sums, but it also counts the number of cells that contain data. Yeah. So I want to try and explain a practical example. So let's go back to our conference attendees data. This time we've added some more information. We've added geographical region and we've added age group. And this is because our donor has told us that they want to know the age profile of attendees and they want to know the geographical region that they're attending from. So we can use our pivot tables and our count function to create this summary. So let's have a look at that data. Oh, I just need to cancel this. So here is that data. Now I'm going to do my steps to create my pivot table. So step 1, highlight my data. Just check it down. Yeah, that's fine. Step 2, I'm going to insert my pivot table. Step 3, OK. Step 4, I'm going to start dragging. So I want to show an analysis by geographical region. And if I just flip back to my data, you can see that if I count the names, just like we did in the last course, I have 108 entries. So that means I have 108 attendees. So now I want to split those over these geographical areas. So I know that there's 108 entries in my name. So if I drag that into values, it's counting how many names are there against each geographical area. So the pivot table has been able to do that analysis for me. The donor in this case also asked for age distribution. So I could pull that in here, or I could pull the age group across the top, or I could simply end up creating 2 pivot tables, and there's one with my age in. Okay, so I want to show you how count can be useful and how pivot tables are not only for finance professionals but can be used by other people within the organisation to really neatly analyse data. Of course, you need to encourage your M&E teams to keep really good table data in order to achieve this. So let's return to the notes. I have put a warning here. Remember in the last course how we looked at how blank cells can cause problems. So if one of our name cells had been blank, because there's supposed to be 108 attendees, if we'd have used that column in our count values and there was a blank, then it wouldn't have totaled up the right number of attendees. So that reiterates why it's so important to get that table data right in the first place and to check it for accuracy and completeness. So I know sometimes it can be a little hard to conceptualize how to use the count in pivot tables. So just keep working on it. But for now, let's go to the Excel data and we'll have a go at that exercise. Okay, so now I want to look at changing data and making corrections in pivot tables. So the first thing to look at is drilling down to investigate errors. Let's have a look at this pivot table here. What are the errors? Well, firstly, it's very obvious that the bank charges haven't added up properly because there's an error message. Next, we can see that there's a blank here. Why is there a blank? Because if there was a column that said office expenses, there should have been an office expense written in it. So that can't be right. And finally, this grand total doesn't work because there's an error in one of the numbers within that total. So to investigate the reasons for these errors, pivot tables have an amazing function. All we do is go to the sum amount and double click, and let me show you what happens. So if I go to my errors here and let's double click, and what Excel has done is it's produced a breakdown of all the entries that were making up that one number. And you can see it's immediately brought to the top, this one here with name. So that's obviously an error that needs correcting, but I can use my filters as well, just like I learnt in the last course, to check. So I'll just check that that was the only name error. Why is it hidden there? Interesting. Okay, pause. Okay, so I can immediately see that it's brought my error to the top. I can't quite read these, but luckily I learnt last time how easy it is to drag these so I can read the full narrative. So that is an error, so I need to address that. I think in this case we can see that it was bank charges for December, and in November and October they were 165, so I'm fairly confident to assume that they're 165 in this example. So I don't lose the sheet, I'm going to make sure I write bank charges here. If I go back here, I've got another error, the blanks. So let's double click and see what makes that up. And here I can see, the expense type is missing, as I suspected, but there's a very good description. So I can see that they should have been bank charges. So I need to amend them to bank charges. Now I know what the errors are. I actually don't need this sheet anymore, so I'm going to delete it. Let's just return to the notes. So I have now been able to drill down and find those errors. So just go over to the Excel data and try that drilling down yourself. Just double click and see what happens in the breakdown, just really quickly. Great. Now that you've had a look, probably get it out there. Who knows what? Great. So just a few observations from that is that when you double click, it brings up a new worksheet called Sheet X. And as I've said many times, remember to rename the worksheet so you can find it again. It is really easy to start double clicking, and soon you have so many breakdowns and sheets and you can get really lost in your spreadsheet. The breakdown appears in a table format with filters automatically applied. Freeze panes is not automatically applied, but you can put it on yourself, just as we learned in the last course. And you might want to, because from time to time, you might be dealing with a breakdown of data that's 100, 1,000 entries, and so freeze panes might make sense. And when Excel sums and presents numbers in pivot tables, there are no comma dividers. So if you want to change that format, you can. So let's understand what data the pivot table is looking at. So if we go back to step 3 of creating a pivot table, when this box comes up, it's indicating here that this is the data that it's looking at. So in this example, the pivot table is looking at the sheet that's called Office Expenses, and it's looking at cells A3 to E56. Now, it is critical to remember that this is the source of the pivot table, and so all corrections made to data must be made in this original source data. If you correct errors in the breakdown sheets, those changes will not be reflected in the pivot table. Yeah, that's why I deleted them, because I knew that I wasn't going to need them, because I must make my changes and correct my data back in the original source data. Once I have corrected my original source data, I go back to my pivot table, I hover over it, I right click and I press refresh, and then my changes will be processed. So before I show you a practical example, just go to the exercises and have a go at that yourself. Okay, so you've had a go yourself. I'll just run through hopefully what you all achieved. So we started with our pivot table with errors, and we had already found out that there was an error here and that we needed to amend these blanks. So I go back to my data here and I need to find my gaps. So there I found my gaps. Yes, that was the entries, wasn't it? So I'm going to amend those and add in bank charges. And here was the name error, and I knew that that was 165. And now on my pivot table, I'm going to right click and refresh. And now I can see that everything in my pivot table has been solved. Now, personally, I'm just going to undo those to preserve this data with errors. Okay. So sometimes we might want to change the source data. Say, for example, we get a new batch of M&E results in, or we have an additional month of transactions. We need to add them perhaps to the bottom and expand the pivot table. In our example here, we have found some missing invoices, so we need to add them into our pivot table. So step 1 is make sure that the additional rows of data are added where the source data was. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that up to row 56, that was where my original data ended. And now in blue, these are the missing invoices that have been added on. Yeah. But you can still see that they're following the rules of expense type. It says, and they do say expense type, the amount is here, they're in the same format. Now I need to go back to the original table or range or source data. And this is a little bit tricky to find, so I'll just navigate you through this. When you have an active pivot table, an extra section appears on your ribbon. And it's here, Pivot Table Tools, Analyze and Design. And it's just a slightly darker colour than the rest of the ribbon. And if you follow the drop downs here to change data source and click on this, then we will activate the box where we can change our data source. So it's easier to show this in a live example. So let's return here. So this was the pivot table, and this is where I now want to add on those. In fact, I should just re-amend the errors. Yeah. And so now I want to add on the missing invoices. So you can see here it is, my extra ribbon piece has appeared, and I want to do some analysis, change data source. Yep. And that brings up my change data source, and you can see that it is, that's because I'd already amended it. Okay, cancel. Okay, so here I'm going to change my data source, and you can see that the crackling is around the original data that I had highlighted for the pivot table. But now I want to add these on. So there's two options. The first option, and my preferred option, is that we just re-highlight to make sure that we've captured everything that we wanted. And we can now see that this is updated to 62, which is what we wanted. The other way is that if it was just a small amount of data, I could just manually amend it here, but I prefer to highlight. If you've added more columns, then this data refresh will also add in those extra columns and mean that they become available in your options. If you want to add in additional columns, this changing of the data source will also bring in those additional columns, and then they will appear as options in your pivot table builder. So I've selected OK, and so now I once again refresh, and now my pivot table contains all of that data, including the new invoices. So now we need to check the pivot tables as we expected. So just go and have a go at that, adding in those extra invoices for yourself. Now, some people may have said, but how do I check it? How do I check the completeness? Well, the answer is reconciliation, and hopefully as accountants, we thought of that and are clear what a reconciliation is. So something I would always do at the end of my pivot table when I'm adding new data and to every pivot table is I will just do a quick reconciliation check myself, because whilst Excel is very reliable, I could have accidentally got the wrong reference right at the end. So the easiest way to do a quick reconciliation is using the quick sum that we learnt about in the previous course. So if I total up my column here, I can see that my sum is 193,265. So that's the total that I would also be expecting to see within the pivot table. So if I look at my pivot table, 193265, I'm confident that it's reconciled. And so now I have faith in myself that I've captured all the data that I meant to. So let's take a look at frequent mistakes in pivot tables. In the example below, we've tried to create a pivot table, but an error message has appeared. So let me just zoom up on this pivot table, on this error message. Oh, whoops, it's gone a bit crazy. Come back. Taking the wrong page now. Great. Okay. So here's the error message that's appeared. And the key thing to read here, it says to create a pivot table report, you must use data that is organized as a list with labeled columns. And this goes back to what we were saying in the previous course about a lovely data table clearly labeled in the first place. And if I look up here on my table, I can see that actually what's happened is that I actually don't have any column headers for these two columns, and hence Excel cannot create a pivot table from them. So to remedy that, I'd go back and put in hotel and date, try again, and then I'd be able to create a pivot table. Related to this is hidden columns, and this is a very frequent thing. So for example, say I want to create a pivot table here, and I've put in a blank column here just for presentation because I thought it looked nice. And now I try and do my pivot table. It looks like it's going to work. Oh, it did work. Why did it work? Interesting. It's weird. So we do this one. Right. So let's go back to this data here and say I put in a column here because I thought it looked nice. And then I insert my pivot table. Take that out of the notes then. Okay, so one small thing that I wanted to just remind everybody about was not to panic if you lose your pivot table builder. You can always access this by going to any pivot table, and then you need to find a pivot table. Here we go. And if it's gone, you just click at any cell inside the pivot table and your builder is back. The other frequent error is, of course, trying to change the data directly in the pivot table. You cannot change the sums and the values in a pivot table, else you get this error message. For example, I try and change this, and quite rightly it gives me that warning message to remind me that this data is being dragged from the source data, and we can only make a change through the source data. Another thing I just wanted to quickly look at is copying and pasting pivot tables. Just like we learned in the last course, the first course in fact, that if we highlight the whole pivot table, then we can paste the whole pivot table into a new worksheet or a different area. I just want to show you that. So if I copy the whole of this pivot table with Control C, and then in a new sheet, Control V, the whole of my pivot table has been pasted. And that means that there is all the pivot table functionality there, and it's all looking back to that same source. So now I might decide that here I want a different pivot table. Yeah. If I had just copied part of the pivot table, you'll see here I've accidentally forgotten to copy the top row, and I paste it in here. And I paste it in a new sheet here. Oh, it won't even let me do it. So if I copy all of the pivot table, oh, sorry. So if I copy all of the pivot table, and then I'm just going to Control C to copy it, and I'll paste it here, Control V, it's created another pivot table. So it's looking back to the same source data, but I can reformat this one if I want, and maybe I wanted expenditure type here below. Okay. Had I instead only, I'll just escape, had I instead only copied part of the pivot table, because you see here I've missed out the top row, and now I try to paste it, you can see that you can see from the values up here that has just pasted values. Yeah. I can, of course, if I want to just paste this as an entire table as values, I do Control C, and then just like we did before, I can right click, find my values, paste as values, and then I'm just pasting the results of my table without all the access to the pivot table behind it. And the reason that it's important to show you that is that sometimes you might not want to be sending a pivot table, but you might just want to snapshot the summary of various pivot tables into a document or something. Now, 5.5, a little quirk to look at, is using numbers within a pivot table in a formula outside a pivot table. So, in this example, I want to multiply these results times 2. Maybe I'm doing a forecast, we're going to extrapolate these. So in this cell here, I've simply done B4 times 2, or times C4, equals 5960. So I can see that that's correct, it's worked. Now, if I hover over it and get my little square and drag down, you can see that the result here is not quite as I expected. And this is just a little quirk of one drawback of pivot tables, in that it just can't keep looking at the row of data, so it will always do this copy function. So I'll just show you that. If I go back to my pivot table here, so say I want to times this by 2, so I'll do equals this times 2, and I can see that that's a result that I was expecting, and I drag it down and it's not worked. So the quick get around here, and I do this all the time actually, is to just copy, paste the values right next door to it, and then in my next column I can start the calculations without a problem. Yeah. If I refresh the table, just remember obviously that you need to repaste here, and that would refresh the formulas, or refresh the answers from the formulas, I should say. Okay, so let's go and have a go at project activities pivot and do those exercises. Great, we're nearly there now. A couple of things in advanced pivot tables. I just wanted to highlight that once you get the hang of pivot tables, you can use them for so many different types of presentation. So what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that from this simple piece of data, where we have expenses, project, office date, local currency, donor currency, we can format that in so many different ways. So here we've got a summary by office and by currencies. Here we've got a summary by project, and then under that the breakdown of expenditure type and the expenses. And in this one at the bottom here, we've got a timeline showing month by month the expenses. And Excel has automatically put these in month order for us. So I'll just show you how I arrived at that one. So here was that data. So I'm going to follow my pivot steps. So I'm going to step 1, highlight. Step 2, I'm going to insert. Oh, I lost my step 2, insert. Step 3, OK. Step 4, I'm going to start my dragging. So here I did it by project, and then I also want to see the expense types underneath, and then I wanted to see my dates across the top, and I wanted to see it by local currency. And maybe I also want to see it by donor currency. And now it's getting on for quite a big pivot table, but you know, the information is still there. So this is just to show you that there's so much playing around and maneuverability that you can start working with once you feel comfortable. Again, because I don't want to keep it, I'm deleting it, else it'll just be another sheet that I'll get lost in. So the other thing I wanted to draw to your attention is that within pivot tables, you can use sort and filter just like we've been using before. You've seen that pivot tables automatically add filters. And another useful way to apply a filter is by using this filter field here. You'll have seen that in the previous pivot tables that we've been doing, we've kind of ignored that field. We've been using rows, columns, and values. But let me just show you how the filter field can be used as well. So if I go back to this example, do step 1, step 2, step 3. And this time I'm going to put in my expense type in my rows. I'm going to put in my local currency in my values. But this time I'm going to drag my project into my filters. And when I drag something into the filter section, it creates a new row here, which is still within the pivot table. And from here, I have the option to say now somebody pops into my office and says, what are the horizon costs? I can quickly say, oh, look, horizon costs are nearly 3 million because I've just filtered quickly on horizon. And then my project manager comes in and says, I need to know Seaview and Vantage together. I can give them a total there. We're just at 500,000. So, you know, there's useful ways of using using filters there. If I had lots more, I could maybe put my months in here. I could have a look and say, oh, what month did you want to look at? Oh, we wanted to just see what we did in April. There you go. Yeah, so there's so many ways of playing around with pivot tables. The secret is to get the balance right between playing around with them and not wasting too much time, because you want to find the views and the functionality that really, really works for you. Okay. So this is a really important section, actually, thinking about your user, because whilst you might master pivot tables and become a complete wizard on them, the person that you send a pivot table to might not be. Absolutely real example this week. My husband received a pivot table from a colleague and he didn't know how to use it, and I had to go and show him. So just think that the person that you're sending a pivot table to may, well, really quite frequently will not know how to use it. So you might need to tell them, give them some brief instructions. You might want to tell them they can double click to get a breakdown. Auditors, you might want to tell auditors how to use them, because one thing I find super useful for audit is that if you give them a pivot summary, they can double click and get a listing that's the breakdown, and then they can pick their sample from it. And so the results of the pivot tables are probably useful to many people, like dashboards for management or for your board, for proposals, for donors, for your website, for your annual reports, for your M&E. But it might be that you just include the snapshot of the summary and you don't need to send the full pivot table with all the backup. So just always think about your user. So we've reached the end, so I just want us to have a quick consolidation of what we've learned today. So why are pivot tables useful? Well, they are a super fast way to summarize data. They let you arrange, rearrange, they help you analyze data and spot errors. You create neat, succinct tables for pasting into other documents. It's an easy way to drill down into data, and it reduces a lot of risk of manual error. What do pivot tables depend on? Excellent data to begin with, arranged in a table format. How do you create a pivot table? Step 1, highlight. Step 2, insert. Step 3, OK. Step 4, drag. Step 5, done. Step 6, name the worksheet. And how do we amend or correct data in a pivot table? Always go back to the source data and then refresh the pivot table. Source and refresh. And how do you master pivot tables? You practice, practice, practice. So let's start that practice now by doing these consolidation exercises. Okay, thanks for listening today, and any questions, just get in touch.